In a world ruled by men and empires, she carved her name into history with nothing but her wit, charm, and unshakable will. Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh of Egypt, wasn't just a woman of beauty, but a strategist, linguist, and political genius who stood toe-to-toe with the might of Rome. From her legendary romances with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony to her tragic end that sparked the rise of the Roman Empire, Cleopatra's life was anything but ordinary. But was she truly the seductress Rome painted her to be, or a brilliant queen caught in a deadly game of power? This is the real story of Cleopatra, a journey of love, betrayal, and the battle to protect a kingdom. Cleopatra VII Philopator was born in 69 BCE into the ruling Ptolemaic dynasty of Egypt, a family descended from Ptolemy I Soter, one of Alexander the Great's generals. Though they ruled Egypt, the Ptolemies were of Macedonian Greek origin, and for nearly 3 centuries had held onto their Hellenistic culture, rarely even speaking the native Egyptian language. Cleopatra would be the first in her line to break that pattern, and in doing so, she would distinguish herself early as something more than just another royal heir. Raised in the opulent and dangerous world of Alexandria's royal court, she was educated with the intensity reserved for potential monarchs. She studied at the famed Library of Alexandria, learning philosophy, mathematics, politics, medicine, geography, and astronomy. She mastered multiple languages, including Latin, Aramaic, Syriac, and the Egyptian tongue itself, which many of her predecessors had dismissed. This linguistic ability alone gave her a diplomatic advantage unmatched in her court, allowing her to communicate directly with ambassadors, allies, and subjects without intermediaries. Her world was shaped by extraordinary privilege but also unrelenting political chaos. The Ptolemaic dynasty was infamous for its internal rivalries and deadly family feuds. Siblings often vied for the throne, marriages between brothers and sisters were common to preserve the bloodline, and betrayal was never far from reach. As a young princess, Cleopatra watched these dynamics play out firsthand. Her father, Ptolemy XII Auletes, was forced into exile and later restored to the throne with Roman help, a warning that Egypt's sovereignty was increasingly subject to Rome's will. After his death, Cleopatra inherited the throne alongside her younger brother, whom she was expected to marry according to custom. But Cleopatra was not content to rule as a passive co-sovereign. Even in her early years of rule, she began asserting herself as the true leader, appearing alone on coinage and issuing decrees in her name only, a bold move that challenged both Egyptian tradition and Roman expectations. What made Cleopatra remarkable was not just her political ambition, but how she wielded it. She carefully cultivated her public image, presenting herself as the living embodiment of the goddess Isis, which solidified her status among the Egyptian people while still maintaining her intellectual, Hellenistic persona for the Greek elite. She navigated between cultures with precision, using her charisma, intelligence, and deep understanding of power to build loyalty and inspire fear. Unlike the myth of a seductress who rose through beauty alone, the real Cleopatra was forged in an elite education, sharpened by political survival, and trained in the art of statesmanship. Before she ever met Julius Caesar or Mark Antony, she had already proven that she was not a pawn in history, she was a player. Cleopatra's rise to undisputed power was anything but smooth. After the death of her father, Ptolemy XII, Cleopatra ascended the throne as co-regent with her 10-year-old brother, Ptolemy XIII, whom she was also expected to marry, in line with Ptolemaic custom. But behind the ceremonial titles, real power was contested. The young king was heavily influenced by a cabal of court advisors and guardians, most notably the ambitious eunuch Pothinus and the general Achilles. These figures resented Cleopatra's independent rule and her early assertion of authority. Tensions rose quickly. Within just 3 years, Cleopatra was effectively ousted from power and forced into exile, not in a distant land, but just across the border in Syria, where she began raising her own army to reclaim the throne. It was during this time, as Cleopatra stood at the edge of defeat, that opportunity arrived in the form of Julius Caesar. In 48 BCE, Caesar pursued his rival Pompey to Egypt during the Roman Civil War. Pompey sought refuge in the Egyptian court but was betrayed and murdered upon arrival, a gruesome act intended to curry favor with Caesar. Instead, it horrified him. As Caesar entered Alexandria, he found himself in the middle of Egypt's internal power struggle. Cleopatra seized this moment with brilliant theatricality. According to ancient sources, she had herself smuggled into Caesar's quarters, allegedly rolled in a carpet or sack, to plead her case directly. The move was not just daring, it was genius. Cleopatra knew Caesar valued audacity, intellect, and charisma. Their meeting marked a turning point. Not only did Caesar side with her, but their political alliance quickly turned romantic. With Caesar's military support, Cleopatra returned to Alexandria and waged a brutal civil war against her brother's forces. The conflict culminated in the Siege of Alexandria, a violent and chaotic chapter in both Egyptian and Roman history. Ptolemy XIII ultimately drowned in the Nile while attempting to flee. Cleopatra was restored to the throne, this time as co-ruler with another younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, though her true power was uncontested. Her relationship with Caesar, however, would spark both admiration and outrage across Rome. It was an entanglement that blended politics, love, and legacy, and one that would shape Cleopatra's image forever. In reclaiming her throne, Cleopatra had not only outmaneuvered her enemies but also signaled to the world that she was no ordinary queen. She had survived court betrayal, war, and exile, and emerged more powerful than ever. Cleopatra's relationship with Julius Caesar was far more than a historical romance. It was a masterstroke of political strategy wrapped in charisma, ambition, and shared vision. After regaining her throne with Caesar's military backing, Cleopatra solidified her power in Egypt, but she also looked beyond her borders. She understood, perhaps better than any of her predecessors, that Rome was not only the center of global power, but also the key to Egypt's future sovereignty. Her alliance with Caesar was carefully cultivated, not just a matter of personal attraction, but a mutually beneficial partnership between two world leaders. Cleopatra offered Egypt's wealth, grain, and resources. Caesar offered legitimacy, military might, and protection. Together, they embodied a powerful political axis, one that unsettled Rome and fascinated the world. Their relationship quickly became scandalous back in Rome, where Cleopatra was seen as an exotic and dangerous foreign queen. Yet Caesar welcomed her into the Roman world with boldness. In 46 BCE, Cleopatra traveled to Rome with their son, Ptolemy XV, better known as Caesarion, which translates into Little Caesar. Though Caesar never formally acknowledged the boy as his heir, the implications were clear. Cleopatra was housed in Caesar's villa outside Rome, a highly public and controversial move that left the Roman Senate in outrage. Statues of her were erected in temples, and her presence at Caesar's side was impossible to ignore. The message was evident. Cleopatra was not a mere mistress, but a queen, a political partner, and perhaps, in Caesar's mind, an empress in waiting. The bond between them extended beyond politics. Cleopatra and Caesar were both visionaries, fluent in the language of power, and unafraid to challenge conventions. While Caesar dreamed of reshaping Rome into an empire under his sole rule, Cleopatra dreamed of an Egypt that could stand equal to Rome, rich, stable, and independent. Their union symbolized the merging of two ancient powers, a legacy of East and West. However, that dream was abruptly cut short. In 44 BCE, Caesar was assassinated by his political enemies on the Ides of March, a brutal blow that sent shockwaves through Rome and left Cleopatra vulnerable once more. With Caesar's death, Cleopatra and Caesarion fled back to Egypt. Though her Roman alliance had crumbled, she had given birth to a legacy. Caesarion, in her eyes, was the rightful heir not just to Egypt but to Rome itself, a claim that would make the boy a future threat to Caesar's Roman rivals. Cleopatra now stood alone again, but not as the exiled queen she once was. This time, she was a mother, a ruler, and a survivor, prepared to shape the next chapter of her destiny. After the death of Julius Caesar, the Roman world was plunged into chaos, split between those who sought to avenge him and those who fought to control what remained of his empire. In this turbulent landscape emerged another towering Roman figure, Mark Antony, a skilled general and one of Caesar's closest allies. When Cleopatra met Antony in 41 BCE, their union would become one of the most iconic and controversial in history. She did not approach him as a grieving widow, but as a sovereign queen, arriving famously on a golden barge adorned like the goddess Isis, shimmering in silk and surrounded by music and incense. It wasn't just seduction, it was spectacle, diplomacy, and power on full display. Antony was captivated. What began as a political meeting quickly evolved into an alliance both romantic and strategic. Cleopatra offered Egypt's riches and loyalty. Antony, in return, offered military strength and access to Rome's eastern provinces. Their bond deepened as they spent the winter of 41 to 40 BCE in Alexandria, indulging in revelry but also plotting power. Cleopatra gave birth to twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, and later a third son, Ptolemy Philadelphus. Their union was not merely a love affair, it was the merging of two dynasties with ambitions of ruling the known world. Together, Antony and Cleopatra ruled over the eastern Mediterranean like a divine pair. He gave her control over vast Roman territories, Cyprus, Crete, parts of Syria, and openly lived with her as consort, defying Roman tradition and inflaming his enemies back in Rome. Their court in Alexandria was a glittering center of culture and politics, where Egyptian and Hellenistic customs thrived and where Cleopatra was worshipped not just as a queen but as a goddess. But their rise provoked the wrath of Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus, who painted their alliance as a betrayal of Rome, portraying Cleopatra as a manipulative seductress who had ensnared Antony and turned him against his own people. As the Roman world edged closer to civil war, Antony and Cleopatra stood defiant, ruling as king and queen over a territory stretching from Egypt to Armenia. Their story was no longer just personal, it was imperial. And in choosing each other, they would ultimately challenge the very heart of Roman power. The stage was now set for one of history's most legendary downfalls. As Antony and Cleopatra's alliance grew stronger, so too did the fury in Rome. At the heart of it stood Octavian, Julius Caesar's adopted son and heir, who now sought absolute control over the Roman Republic. To achieve this, he needed to eliminate Antony, and what better way than to weaponize his love for Cleopatra? Rome's political stage became a battlefield of words long before it became one of swords. Octavian launched a vicious propaganda campaign, portraying Antony as a traitor bewitched by a foreign queen, a man who had abandoned Roman values for Egyptian luxury and decadence. Cleopatra, once seen as a clever monarch, was now depicted in Roman rhetoric as a dangerous seductress, a sorceress who threatened to bring down the very foundations of Rome. Octavian painted a picture that was as politically useful as it was deliberately false: that Antony had given away Roman lands to Cleopatra and declared Caesarion, her son by Julius Caesar, the rightful heir to Rome. The truth was far more complex, but perception is power, and Octavian wielded it masterfully. He read Antony's will aloud in the Roman Senate, claiming it proved Antony intended to be buried in Alexandria and leave Roman territories to Cleopatra's children. The scandal was enough to ignite public outrage. The Senate, stirred by national pride and fear of foreign influence, declared war, not on Antony directly, but on Cleopatra. It was a cunning move. By targeting Cleopatra, Octavian unified Roman factions under the banner of patriotism and defense against an outsider. Cleopatra, meanwhile, prepared for the inevitable. She and Antony amassed their forces, knowing they would soon face Octavian's legions in a final, bloody confrontation. But the tides of Roman favor had already turned. Cleopatra was no longer seen as a queen. In the eyes of Rome, she was an enemy of the state. The lovers stood on the brink of war, not only for their own survival, but for the fate of their kingdoms and their children. What followed would become one of history's most famous naval battles, and the beginning of their tragic end. The final chapter of Cleopatra's reign is marked by tragedy, defiance, and a desperate fight to preserve power and dignity in the face of overwhelming odds. After years of political maneuvering, alliances, and warfare, Cleopatra's world came crashing down following the decisive naval battle of Actium in 31 BCE. This confrontation was not merely a battle of ships, but a clash between two visions of the future: Octavian, Rome's rising power, and the combined forces of Mark Antony and Cleopatra, the rulers of the eastern Mediterranean. Cleopatra and Antony commanded a vast fleet and army, but their forces were plagued by internal divisions, wavering loyalties, and strategic missteps. As the battle unfolded on the Ionian Sea, the tide turned against them. According to historical accounts, Cleopatra's ships suddenly withdrew from the fight, sailing away toward Egypt. Antony, in a controversial decision, chose to follow her rather than rally his forces, leading to the disintegration of their fleet. Whether this retreat was planned or an act of panic remains debated, but it ultimately sealed their defeat. Retreating to Alexandria, Cleopatra and Antony faced a rapidly shrinking world. Octavian's forces advanced relentlessly, intent on capturing the queen and ending the Ptolemaic dynasty once and for all. Inside the Egyptian capital, Cleopatra prepared for the inevitable siege. With calm resolve, she arranged for her treasures and possessions to be secured, and she made ready the tomb she hoped would be her final resting place. The toll of the defeat weighed heavily on Antony. False news reached him that Cleopatra had died, and grief-stricken, he took his own life with a sword. Historical records describe a deeply tragic scene. Antony's deathbed was Cleopatra's embrace, a final moment of love and loss intertwined. With Antony gone, Cleopatra was left to face Octavian alone. Captured alive, Cleopatra could have been paraded through Rome as a trophy, humiliated and stripped of her status. But she was determined not to be broken. Instead, she chose death on her own terms. According to tradition, Cleopatra took her own life shortly after Antony's death, most famously by the bite of an asp, a symbol of royalty and divine power in ancient Egypt. Others suggest she may have used poison. Regardless of the method, her death was a final act of sovereignty and defiance. Cleopatra's suicide was more than an escape, it was a statement. She refused to be a prisoner, a curiosity, or a tool of Roman propaganda. In death, she preserved her dignity, her power, and her identity as the last pharaoh of Egypt. Her passing marked the end of an era, the end of the Hellenistic age and Egypt's independence. Cleopatra's impact on history goes far beyond the dramatic events of her life and death. As the last active ruler of the Ptolemaic kingdom of Egypt, she symbolized the end of an era and the beginning of a new world order dominated by Rome. Despite being often reduced to myths of seduction and scandal, Cleopatra was a highly intelligent and politically savvy leader who spoke multiple languages, understood diplomacy, and fought tirelessly to preserve her kingdom's independence in a male-dominated world. Her legacy has been distorted by centuries of Roman propaganda, yet modern historians have begun to reclaim her true story, one of ambition, resilience, and complexity. Cleopatra challenged the expectations placed on women in power, navigating intense rivalries and international politics with boldness and strategy. Her life continues to inspire debates about gender, leadership, and cultural identity, reminding us how women have shaped history even when the record tries to erase them. From Shakespearean drama to Hollywood films, Cleopatra's image endures as a symbol of charisma and tragedy. But beneath the glamour lies a ruler whose influence helped shape the course of Western civilization. Today, her story encourages us to look beyond surface impressions and appreciate the depth and nuance of those who dared to rule against all odds. What do you think about Cleopatra's story? Was she a brilliant leader ahead of her time or just a pawn in Rome's power games? Drop your thoughts below. We want to hear how you see this legendary queen's legacy. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, the simple, easy and free way to support us is by hitting the like button and subscribing to our channel. Don't forget to tap the bell icon. This way you take control of what you watch instead of letting the algorithm decide for you. See you in the next story.